What is race for me? What is race for all of us? That's the potent question, isn't it? On the one hand, we're in a moment where we are reckoning with the fact that there's nothing, shall we say, natural about race, that it's not something like, shall we say, hardwired biologically into us. And yet, this fictive reality is anything but socially fictive, anything but politically fictive. It's socially and politically effectual, real in some sense.
We know, and scientists have said now for nearly 100 years, that race in and of itself is not itself a biological genetic category.
Like any other category in society, whether it be race, class, gender, these are socially constructed categories. People categorize and fashion and fit people into certain niches in society.
And I always answer by saying, race is nothing, yet is everything. And before we talk about race, we want to talk about the engine of race. The engine of race is racism.
The category of race has almost always, but not exclusively, been built in relationship to systems of oppression.
What we mean by race is a political event. It's a political activity. Race is about being politically positioned, socially positioned.
It is not just to mark difference, it's to mark difference by also preventing others from partaking in full citizenship. In this country, that's the way it has worked since the founding with slavery and then post-slavery.
The category of white was a category that emerged as laws decided which bodies could and could not be legally enslaved, could and could not be legally targeted for genocide.
Police about what we collectively do to produce a system that gives systemic advantage to some and systemic disadvantage to others. So today, as yesterday, the issue is not the bad apples, but the apple tree.
Whiteness is, in the United States, is the culture, the set of legal practices wherein which those categorized as white are always at the top. So whiteness is a phenomena that exists well beyond the will of individual people who might be categorized as white.
What we know of our founding fathers is that the democracy that this country is founded on, freedom and justice and life and liberty to all, it was never intended for the black body. And so that which of course reinforces this ideal is what we've seen in history, and that is chattel slavery.
For many Americans, the Southern Italian was a racial problem.
And so you had this sort of prejudice develop against the immigrants, and you would see it in the language and the way in which the immigrants were labeled as quote-unquote Dagos, greasers, etc.
Their whiteness was questioned. Swarthy is a term that was used quite frequently, and this dark complexion to describe them. And one thing you see is that they attempt to call out white Americans again for their treatment of African Americans, and as a symbol and as an example of this kind of white barbarism.
But they also understood that they weren't black. And so that becomes the significant test, whiteness.
And over time, immigrant groups learned to do things like change their last names so they would sound more Anglo-Saxon Protestant, give up their ethnic cultures and practices, and essentially assimilate into whiteness. And they assimilated into not just a white racial identity, but a white supremacist racial identity that then became the legacy that we've all inherited today. We give up so much to become white. If I encounter a racist moment as a white person and I don't say anything because it's too scary, I give up a piece of my humanity.
I think that's the ultimate cost, that once you buy into a system of white over black, it just reinforces the unequal system of justice in the United States.
One has to first name the sin of whiteness. And that is not the sin of people who happen to look like white Americans, but the sin of living into whiteness as we understand whiteness to be that which oppresses, and to understand that to be raced white is an anathema to what it means to be Christian.
We must re-engage the question of Jesus, right? Pry that figure symbolically, ecclesially, so on and so on. Pry that figure away from the figure of the white, enact a kind of separation again, and rethink who the figure of Jesus is.
It's amazing to me to watch white students or white faculty who are deeply committed to equality. Something racist happens, and in their own embodiment as a white person, they freeze and find themselves unable to respond because they're either afraid of being racist or they don't want to offend the other white person or whatever it is, right? Every time we fail to respond, even in the face of something small, we actually reconstruct our own racial identity. So we actually reaffirm a kind of racist whiteness, even if we're not wanting to do that.
You need to begin slowly trying to build a more interracial life. Yeah? So it's not enough to say, I'm an anti-racist, but I live in an all-white neighborhood, and my kids go to all-white schools, and all my friends and significant others are white, but I'm a good person. Yeah? So part of the drama is that you need to change your life.
In many ways, I think the only way to dismantle a system like that is for folks to who enjoy the privilege of whiteness to rise up and demand that there no longer is a privilege of whiteness.
Even if you are in that conversation with family members where Uncle Lester says some unkind things about people of color, I think that a person of courage and deep belief, should be able to say, Uncle, although I love you, this commentary is not acceptable. Let's engage, yeah? You may not be invited back to Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah, but you'll be able to be a moral person.
We're going to make mistakes as white people. We're going to do and say racist things. It's part of our socialization. We have to work it out. And what those of us who've learned to do it or practice doing it discover is that when we start to do it, we get better at it. We become more able, we come to understand things differently than if we never take that risk.
The racism that allows or rationalizes a society to enslave part of its population doesn't go away once slavery as a system is gone. That type of racism exists and persists.
If we recognize something has been constructed, we can always challenge, change, or deconstruct it. And the way race has been constructed in the United States when it comes to whiteness has been such a saturating, unjust, inequitable, and really, again, deeply violent structure that I think it's empowering when we realize I could actually actively choose to engage in a different construction process.
And with any social problem, the approach to deal with the problem cannot be, let's not talk about it. So I think that the way for us to ultimately deal with race is by being serious about how race matters today, yeah?
I would encourage us to understand the Black Lives Matters movement as a certain kind of, in my language now, paratheological disruption, right, of the practices of whiteness, again, zeroing in on that problem and disrupting it.
Sometimes I will say we, in any given moment, are either making an environment safer for racism or making it safer for people of color. And as white folks, our challenge is to constantly be figuring out how to take actions that make it clear that this environment must not be safe for racism and instead needs to be safer for people of color.
I do believe that this is one of those moments and that God is working to disrupt this unjust status quo of, in this instance, this racial injustice, to bring us to a different point of relationship, to begin to name racism in this country, but to name it at its roots.